This is Platemark. My name is Ann Shafer, and I am your host. You found us at Series 3 of Platemark, in which I interview the wonderful people who occupy the print ecosystem. Today's guest is Ruth Lingen, whose name you've probably heard in other episodes. She was part of the team at Pace Editions when Bill Hall and Julia DeMario were there. She's now running a press called Line Press Limited alongside Nina Dine, and they're doing just about everything from woodcuts relief to etching intaglio to lithograph to digital. The only thing they don't do is screen print. She's hilarious and a wonderful storyteller. I think you'll enjoy her. So buckle up and give it a listen. My positionality before I start, it's only right to make it clear. I identify as a cis-het white woman, and I use the pronouns she, her. I record Platemark in Baltimore, Maryland, the land of the Piscataway Conoy people. Any images that we talk about during our conversation will be available over on platemarkpodcast.com in the show notes. Also over on platemarkpodcast.com, there's a support and donate button. You can click it and you'll get two options there. Figure out which one you want to take and help me keep the lights on. I think that's it. Let's buckle up and get rolling. Ruth, it's great to see you. Thank you for coming on Platemark. Can you lead off by introducing yourself for our listeners?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I have been a printmaker, paper maker, pretty much my entire life. I studied that stuff in college and grad school, and then have set off to worked in a lot of different studios, a lot of different projects. I really enjoy it. I think I really found my calling with it, and continue to print to this day. I'm sitting here in my studio now in Brooklyn called Line Press Limited. Basically, we can do letterpress here, book arts. I'm doing a lot of artist books right now, which is one of my first loves. And we can do lithography, stuff on the etching press.
Everything but screen, maybe?
Yeah, no screen printing. And, we have done some types of very basic sort of intaglio printing, but nothing like, say, a printer like Julia DeMario does.
Right. Well, she says you're the relief guru.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's very nice of her. Yeah, I love doing woodcuts. I love that juicy ink and just love lino cuts and all kinds of anything, especially things you can print on the Vandercook or even on the letterpress. Doing a lot of woodcut printing right now for an artist book.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
As I've been talking to people, many of them have invoked your name. And so I thought, okay, it's time to talk to Ruth.
Yay. Great. Thank you. Well, when you stick to one thing for long enough,
You get a rep.
Yes, you certainly do.
Yeah.
And I have worked with a lot of great printers. I've been lucky that way. A lot
it
of
sure
great
seems
printers.
like it. Yeah. You take us back, maybe not to kindergarten, but how did you ever I didn't trip over printmaking, really. I did a lino cut in fourth grade, but how do you fall into this thing? You have to really search for it.
Well, I went to, I always liked making stuff as a kid, and my dad had a darkroom in the basement. So I think I was drawn to helping him make these black and white pictures from an early age. And then going off to college, I really started out as a painter because, when you don't know and you want to just be an artist, that's what you start with, right? So, and I'd won a couple contests in my early years. So I was like, okay, I can make money doing this. I was all about making the money. So when I went to college, I was, the first year I was a painting major, and then I took a class in, I think they called it graphics at that time at USD. And the teacher was John Rousseau. He was my undergrad professor, one of them. And he was so great. And there was a big type shop there. So we set type by hand, and I just fell in love with the type because it was like jewelry, like these tiny little pieces of perfect cast. And I loved the process of setting type. I know it's crazy because so many people think it's super tedious, but I actually really like it. I find it very relaxing. So I kind of fell in love with graphics then, and I switched my major to become a printmaker. I think actually, technically, maybe my undergrad degree was graphic design, maybe, but it wasn't anything like you'd think of graphic design now. It just meant you did printmaking And, I'd already printed, I want to say 2 or 3 artist book editions by the time I got out of undergrad.
Whoa.
Yeah, because John Rousseau was really an inspiring teacher. And the year I graduated, he moved, I think, off to Arizona. Also, I had another great professor, undergrad, Lloyd Menard, and he taught all the different printmaking process in one room, like etching, litho, woodcut, everything. And that was my first intro to collaborative printmaking, but you wouldn't really think of it like that back then. He brought an artist in, and they would come into the print shop, and you had to drop everything for the full week they were there. You had to be there 9 to 5 and 9 to 9 if you had to. And you did an edition. And Sydney Shavitz was one of the people, and Claire Romano came. And those are the 2 artists that were in it the year I did it. And we cranked out editions for these artists in like a week. And I remember distinctly with Claire Romano, there was like 12 of us printing or something. We each had a little piece of a holograph plate, and we're printing away. And so we made these editions of things with these real working artists. And it was super exciting, and she gave us all a copy of them. And that was also Lloyd who created this curse for me that I have to this day, which was he'd set the timer and he'd say, okay, we did that one in 7 minutes. Let's take it down to 6.5 minutes. So like I do that all the time. I set the timer constantly. Everyone
like
that's ever
wiping?
printed with me knows about me and the timer.
Oh my God. You mean like in how long it takes you to wipe a plate and that kind of thing?
Yeah, because it's just, I like to plan it out that way and just see how many can we get done, da, 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 da. And then, I don't do it all the time, but it's really good for planning for your whole team and everybody's. How long does it take?
Wow.
Yeah, but that was sort of my introduction then. And then John Rousseau had actually studied with Walter Hamady in Madison, Wisconsin. He said, Ruth, you should go out to Madison and study with Walter. So I thought, okay, great. But I took a year and I decided to go get a job. So I got a job in Omaha screen printing in this commercial screen printing shop, because that was something I also did in undergrad. And I was down in this really disgusting basement, like screen printing vinyl covers and calendars on the back of vinyl, like notebooks that they would custom make into notebooks. And there were all these water bugs down in my exposure room. So I tromped down to the basement with my screens and I turned the lights on and they'd all go scuttling. But it wasn't even that. It was just, I thought, oh, I don't know. This is kind of a drag having a real job. So I'm going to go back to school. So then I applied to get into Madison to grad school, and I lucked out because I got a work study job working for Walter Hamady in the type shop. So I was his shop techie assistant for 3 years, the 3 years I was there. So I studied with him, the master.
In that shop, you weren't making the type itself, were you?
No. It was all about printing books. I don't know if you know anything about him or the Perishable Press. I gave a talk at Cooper Union about his typography that it's online somewhere. And he was just the master of typography and all things, bookmaking. So he was the one-man band where made all his own paper in the barn, and then he'd go and print it all. And then sometimes he'd bind it or have other binders in, but he also was all about this collaboration thing of collaborating with living writers, collaborating with artists you knew. So that was what we did in his classes, is we would say, let's find some poet and print up, something they did on our handmade paper. So I was making paper by hand, printing it, doing the woodcuts, lino cut, doing it all, binding them up.
Oh my God.
People that were in those classes at that time, I'm still friends with now, decades and decades later.
Oh,
it's
I'm
a
sure.
real bonding experience. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also kept up with the printmaking in Madison too, with the other printmaking classes too. Litho, I did a lot of litho and screen printing, offset printing, everything.
Oh gosh, you are it. You are all of it in one happy package.
Well, you know what they say, jack of all trades, master of none. So,
I don't believe that.
I have flopped around a lot over the years, but it's been fun.
Well, but you seem to be a person like me who likes variety,
Yes, I do. And I like to find the exact right technique for everything and just figure the project out. Like that's really my favorite thing, is figuring things out in the right way. So you're really doing what's natural to the project, but also what's exploratory and fun. And to do that, you have to have a pretty good command or grasp of what everything can do, And it's hard to do that without having done it a little bit yourself, like the
Sure.
old I know because at Pace, we would have curators that would come in and they weren't practitioners, you know? It's one thing to look at it on a piece of paper. It's another thing to actually like tough it out through, making your first dry point or some horrible thing like that, and actually figure out what's happening. When I was teaching at Whitman College, I taught out west for 2 years, printmaking and book arts. And so these poor kids, I would say, okay, we're going to learn how to do wood engraving. They'd start on it for a day. Then I would take them over because they had a giant collection out there, over 200 books of early printed
Oh, cool.
manuscripts. So I'd pull out these wood engravings, from like 1650, but they'd had a taste of it already. And then it's like their minds were blown because they could really understand what they were seeing and the skill and the time that it took to do these things.
Right. Yeah, I've had conversations with a lot of people about the fact that, when you're a curator, you don't ever have to have made the thing that you are the scholar of, which is
Yeah.
so
Yes.
counterintuitive, and how that idea of knowing exactly how difficult it is to engrave in copper, like, would
Exactly.
change everything. And
Yes.
these are people who are already in, and it would just make it that
Yes.
much more full. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, printmaking is one of those things. It's so deep, and the history of printing just runs parallel to the history of the spread of knowledge. I mean, when you get into like letterpress book arts part and all early image making, I mean, it's so fascinating to me. There's just so many realms of it. And I love it. It's so fascinating.
Yeah, it is for sure. We were visiting when I was back in the day, when I was a member of the Print Council of America.
Oh, I love back in the day.
Back in the day, we had one of our annual conferences was in Los Angeles, and we went to see San Francisco, and we went to see Arian Press.
Oh,
And
yes.
yeah, and did he actually make type for us, or he was just showing us how they make type, because they have all
Yeah.
those machines, and hardly
Yes.
anybody does it anymore. And it was
Yes.
fascinating.
Yes. Yes, it is. It's really fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. I've always loved letter forms. My mom was an artist and dabbled in graphic design, and she had books of letter, fonts and
Yeah.
typefaces or whatever. And I just would pour through these books and the different shapes and the various ways you can make an A, because my name is Ann, and I'd be like
Yeah.
drawing A's all the time.
And
Idea of designing your own font and pouring the lead and making that'd be so cool.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, there's just endless ways you can go about being involved in that part of it all.
You love every aspect, but do you have a favorite? Is bookmaking your thing at the moment?
Yes, kind of, because it encapsulates everything. I'm doing some projects now where I'm making the paper, setting the type, doing all the typography, and I love that. That part of it, and then all the letterpress printing. Then, of course, in the classic style of sort of livre d'artiste kind of things, you make a lot of images for that too. So that's where all these different kinds of printmaking come in. You can do litho, woodcut. I'm doing all kinds of stuff, even some digital printing for some projects now. So yeah, I've got a couple big projects, like 3 or 4 big projects happening now in the book arts realm. And just, other print stuff too. But I like really bizarre, weird, tight, like typesetting stuff too.
What do you mean by that?
Setting things in composed forms. I did this project a few years ago, and I'm trying to get the second volume done. But I found a book on the mechanics of newspaper printing. And I've always loved newspapers, of course, who doesn't like the printed thing? And so I thought, oh, I'm going to print my own newspaper, which means setting type by hand on a 12 pica line with no spacing at the end. And you have literally one point between the type and the rule, and then I mean, it's crazy. And so I thought, oh, this will be really fun to make some newspapers like that. Well, years later, I'm still trying to chug out like the second one, but it was really gratifying to figure the whole thing out, and just like a real typography challenge, like it would have been done every day back in the day. These things would have just been churned out, but those skills are kind of, I mean, I wouldn't say they're lost with letterpress, but they're getting there because so many people go the polymer way, and there's not really like hand composition. But one of my early jobs in New York, I worked at Bound and Company Stationers. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
No.
It was when I first moved to New York, one of my odd jobs, because I had to, make money and stuff. And it was really at that time, Barbara Henry was my boss then. And it was part of the South Street Seaport Museum. And they had a big patron, and I can't remember his name right now, but he really helped them be able to do these projects that really promoted the seaport and the history of letterpress printing. So I want to say I made minimum wage at that time, which I think was $7.50 an hour, but it was a museum job. And so I would get these great things like, oh, just print like a little pamphlet about the Statue of Liberty and just make it really nice. And I loved the job, actually. And I worked there for about a year. And actually, it was during the centennial of the Brooklyn Bridge, which I think was 1986. So that's when I worked there. And I did print a small book edition and lots of ephemera stuff. But that is when I really learned how to, print letterpress stuff and complicated, 3 or 4 color forms where you're setting up all the type, for 3 colors and mixing things all, intertwining them.
This is the problem with prints and everything else that a print alludes to. There's not enough words to describe everything. But in Lancaster, yes, Pennsylvania, every year there's a printers fair.
Yes.
And all the guys with their linotypes and jigs and rigs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
We went this year. It was really, I was like, this is a whole different world. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. One of my summer print jobs, I tried to get print jobs in the summer once I decided, I really liked it. And I got a job in Chicago for one summer printing signage and stuff, but they had a linotype in the basement and the guy that ran it let me run it one day. So that was like super exciting. I got to sit down and punch out a couple lines on a linotype.
Oh my God. The book art seemed to be the way you bridge that end and the fine art, quote unquote, print.
Yes.
And then I feel like there's not that many of you that have gone all the way over to newspaper production, linotyping.
Yes.
You're a unicorn, Ruth.
Yeah, I know. I am a bit of a weirdo that way. But I definitely, there was a certain point when when I moved to New York, like I said, and I was doing all these different jobs. And I thought, well, am I going to just try to make artist books to live? Because I would sell something to, let's say, the New York Public Library. And then I'd get paid and I'd be pondering how to pay my rent, like, sitting and drinking coffee somewhere going, okay, now what do I do? Panic. So that's when I started thinking I'm going to have to get a real job. And then I got the job at Bound, and then I had to leave because I couldn't live on that little money, sadly. But yeah, and I did other odds and ends and until I got the job at Pace, and that's a whole story in and of itself too.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. The minimum wage thing, it's hard to even extrapolate that out to what an annual salary might be. But when I worked as a child, when I got to New York in 1986 after college, and
perfect.
Yeah, and I got a job at the Whitney, and believe it or not, MoMA paid worse than the Whitney, and my starting salary in 1986 was $15,500.
Really? Wow. So you were making the big bucks.
I mean, I don't know how we did it.
No, but I do feel like I feel bad for people now because I would find these apartments and you just go deep out to live near the BQE, but you could find cheap apartments then if you were willing to slog 20 minutes to your closest train. And I don't know if that even exists anymore for how deep in Queens you have to go, but you could do it. You had to put your mind to it, but it was doable then,
Yeah. Yeah. I grew up right outside of New York in Connecticut, and I ended up paying more out of my salary for safety in my own mind. Like we moved to Brooklyn for a hot second, a roommate and me, to Fort Greene, which was, on the up and up. And we, and she got mugged 3 weeks after we moved there, and I got mugged with both of us together 6 weeks after we moved there, and we promptly hightailed it back to the West Side. Sharing a bedroom, which was miserable.
Yeah. The 80s in New York were no joke, They were, because I had I was counting up the other day the number of times I've moved my personal print shop around, and I think it's been 9 in the city. I definitely had a studio in what's now very groovy Williamsburg, but at that time it was so dicey at night, heavy drug dealers and stuff, and you literally look to the corner and run toward the subway, You know what I mean? It was very dicey.
Absolutely do, yeah.
And we could only afford those kind of greasy, dumpy, studio spaces. So
right.
the rite of passage.
So you have to tell us the pace story, since we've had Julia and Bill Hall on,
Oh,
and they were part of the three-legged stool, as we like to
yes, the
say.
three-legged stool. Well, the way it all started was with Joe Wilfer. I was in Madison studying with Walter Hamady, so I was his shop tech. He went on sabbatical for, I think it was the second year I was there, for the spring semester. And this guy named Joe Wilfer came in to teach for him for the semester. So I was automatically his assistant. And as Joe told the story to everybody for years after, he'd say, yeah, and here's my assistant. She comes up to me and she says, hi, I'm Ruth, and I'm going skiing tomorrow. So here's the keys, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. That was the first week, 2 weeks of class. He loved to harass me about that. I said, I don't remember it that way, but okay. But yeah, so he showed up and he was just so inspiring and amazing. And at that time, he had started working on these giant Chuck Close paper things in New York.
Oh.
And he showed them to our class, and I was just so blown away by them, you know? But he was just a wonderful teacher and very, very creative, super generous. He was the funnest guy any of us had ever met, you know? So I got to know him then. And then I ended up finishing my degree. I stayed and taught in Wisconsin for the year after I got out of grad school. And then, you know, I said, okay, I'm going to go track down Joe Wilfer in New York, you know? And at that time, I did have a friend that I'd gone out and visited New York for 5 days. And I was like, this is great. I'm moving out here. So drive out there. And then I got a hold of Joe and I said, hi, Joe, I'm in town. So he started giving me these freelance projects I could do. And I feel like a lot of printers start like that. You run around and do these different projects. They may or may not be your expertise, but you just have to get in there and do them. And the first thing he gave me to work on for Pace, and this was before Spring Street Workshop was set up, was this giant Louise Nevelson edition. And if you ever look it up, it will say printed by Joe Wilfer, but I can assure you that I made this whole edition of 250. Well, there were a number of projects that I did all the production on, and you didn't even get a mention. And it was, we have come a long way in that aspect, but it wasn't anything like Joe didn't want me to have credit. It was just sort of the way it was done. Nobody worried about that, or at least they didn't, when I was involved at that time. So this Louise Nevelson project, Pace had a 10,000 square foot warehouse on 23rd Street that they had moved out of to move down to Soho on Spring Street. So it was sitting there empty, and Joe said, well, I'm going to set you up there and you can do this Louise Nevelson project. And he made 12 he had a rubber mold off of her piece, and he made 12 plaster molds. And the piece, I have it hanging up right here. I can look at it. And the piece was about this big. It was like a foot square maybe. And it was cast paper. And so he said, okay, I've got 12 molds for you. So you're going to come up, make 12, and then let them dry, then come up every 4 days. I'd go up there and I'd pop the 12 out and make 12 more. Well, I had this washing machine that was like an old style one that just swooshes around like you're in the Wild West or something. And I would just take cotton linters and I'd feed them in there, and it would kind of break them down like that. And then I'd make these patties. And I was so panic stricken the whole time because plaster is actually kind of horrible to cast paper in, because it sucks the water right out of it. So you have very little time to sort of like get this thing cast in there before the whole thing is setting up, And also the other thing is the water breaks down the plaster molds over time.
Right.
And I distinctly remember, and this is nothing to say negative about Joe, but I'd say, Joe, I think the molds might be breaking down a little. Do you think we should make some new molds? They're getting these little holes in them, And he'd say, no, they're fine. Just keep going. So I keep going, casting all these 12 or 13 off each mold, right, to get the 250. And I never forgot that then Louise Nevelson came in to sign them, and I was like the deer in the headlights, young, standing in the background. We were just in awe of her because this was in, at the end of her life, and she had like the fur coat and the eyelashes, the whole thing. She was very, very intimidating woman. And Joe was signing with her, and I was just sort of meekly helping push these things along. And she did say this, I swear, I turned beet red. She said, is there any way of making it just really smooth right here where I sign? Because I could, when one would come by and I'd see like the little pits that it was, from the plaster mold, I'd be silently freaking out inside. And, And Joe would say, it's fine. It's printing, but
Now you would probably make those molds in not
in
plaster,
in
maybe
rubber,
silicone or
yes, in
something?
rubber, yes, or silicone or
Yeah.
something, yeah.
Oh,
No, but
golly.
back then it was sort of the Wild West. And then besides that project, Joe would hooked me up with a number of different artists in Soho that I would go around, and I'd go to their studio and help them make cast paper, like Suzanne Anker. I did a number of things for her, and she's now the head of SVA, and a couple other people in Soho. You would just go around and try to cobble together enough money for your rent and stuff. And then when I was working at Bound, I worked there 4 days a week. So every Friday I would go visit Joe, and he was starting to set up the Spring Street workshop and was working on these Julian Schnabel, these giant prints for Pace. They were screen printed maps that then so he was having meetings with him and saying, like, I proposed to Richard Solomon, the head of Pace, that we should set up our own print shop. So he was looking for spaces. And every Friday I'd go up to Pace to the warehouse and I'd say, oh, Joe, don't you need somebody who could do this? And I'd drop off my resume. I'd say, here's my resume in case you need it. I did that literally for about a year. And then one day I went in just to do my usual, firm, not too pushy, but, I'm right here if you need help. And then one day I walked in and Dick said, okay, we're taking you out to lunch to talk about hiring you. And I almost dropped dead. I was like,
Oh,
wow,
wow.
it worked.
Wow.
So yeah, my persistence paid off and I got hired to help Joe. And we worked together for, I want to say 9 years, from maybe it was 10 years and up until he died, sadly, prematurely. But
Yeah. He died young, didn't he?
yes, he was 51.
Oh,
Yeah.
God. Ugh.
But I helped him do some amazing projects. And the big excitement for me was I got to help him finish up these old Chuck Close paper pieces that he'd started back in the early 80s and had never quite finished because they're so big, these giant fills that were something like, I think they're like 64 by 84 inches. They're giant.
Oh,
And they're
yikes.
24 shades of gray. So when we were a little bit slow in the studio, he'd say, okay, well, let's set up and try to make a couple more fills. We were just chugging away on this edition. And to mix the shades of gray, which went from white to black in 24 shades, that one. But Joe had done more complicated ones that were 36 colors that were cool and warm. And so this one was 24 colors. So it would take me about 2 weeks to get the pulp made and get the grayscale, just right, because you'd have to show Chuck the grayscale before you could even start. And, Chuck noticed just everything. He was really
super exacting on those shades.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So then you set that up and then you'd make the pieces. And it took 2 people one day to make one of those big fills.
One. Oh, my heavens.
Probably nobody looking at it would see it. But after a while, I started noticing, oh, Joe fills these we had these light diffusion grills, he called them, these like screens for fluorescent lights. And they're all taped together and they're coated with all the colors and they're complicated. So you're going around filling these with like squeeze bottles of pulp. And I noticed Joe would fill his more than mine. So his would kind of like overflow and you wouldn't see the grid as much as my half would be a little bit like cleaner. So, we ended up making so many extras to get the right number.
Oh, no.
And literally years later, I had to hire people to come in and help me rip up all these extra Chuck Close pieces.
Oh, that's a heartbreaker. Good God.
I was glad to see them get ripped up.
Yeah, right.
I was.
Did Chuck like the visible grid or did he like the overflowing aspect of Joe's method?
Well, he didn't, he liked it sort of in the middle. He didn't like it looking super perfectly clean and neat like a robot, but he didn't like it overly messy either. He was a real wiseacre. He was very, very funny man. And it was really challenging to work on his projects.
Oh, I bet.
And very gratifying too. Probably some of the most gratifying projects I've worked on because you take on these things with him, like the last project I did with him that were just, he himself called it a technological masterpiece.
Oh, hey.
Because the thing was so complicated and so finely detailed. Yeah, and it took 13 rounds of proofs to get the BAT on that one. So
was that more paper pulp or was it?
Yeah, that was Roy. That was Roy.
That
and
is beautiful.
Yeah. It's an amazing piece, actually.
Yeah.
But
I looked at those occasionally when I was at the BMA. They had a pretty small one of the Spitbite self-portraits.
yes.
And then finally we got one of the Lucas Pochoir woodcut multicolor sort
Oh,
of
yes.
as a gift from somebody. So we finally got one that was of a size that you
Oh,
wanted on the wall. But
oh, nice.
I looked at the pulp ones. I was like, oh, that'd be nice.
Yeah, because he came into the studio in 1988, and that was when Spring Street was set up, and that was the first project, and we did a color print with him, a color paper piece that, interestingly enough, he ended up hating later. Chuck would go on in time. He's so discerning that any little thing that might have bugged him a tiny bit, but he'd go with it, then just would, like, it'd be like a mole, like, burrowing in, and he would think about it and think about it. And I'll never forget when he came out once and we were working on this giant, unique canvas. And this was when I was at Pace Paper. So that's probably around 2010. He came out to the studio and I pulled out a whole bunch of my older projects with him, the Lucas, the Roy. And, I'm feeling all good, like, wow, these look great. They're very photogenic pieces, right? And complicated. I'm thinking, wow, this is amazing. I did 50 of these giant Lucases, blah, blah, blah. And he comes out, he looks at it for a while and he said, boy, I sure let you get away with murder, didn't I? But he was very, very funny. So, he had done a print with Aldo Cromley. He did a print of Arnie Glemscher, who's the head of Pace Gallery. I feel like Chuck would decide early on if he liked the thing, like a third of the way in. And then he'd kind of moan and he'd keep going on it. And I did do a reject dud print with Chuck that we ended up ripping up the whole edition. But this Arnie print was with Aldo. He finished it, signed the edition. A couple years later, he was thinking about it. He's like, I really don't like that print. He's like, Ruth, I know you have keys to get to the 8th floor. I want you to go in at night and I want you to go in the drawers and rip those up for me. I don't want those out there. He's like, I hate that print now, And I said, why? It's so nice. He said, it just has all these problems, And
meanwhile, Arnie's like watching the dollar bills get ripped up.
No, but he just, he was and perfectionist isn't, he is, but not in the way where you think of in a super negative way. He looked at each print, even though they're from an edition, same plates, you're trying to be as absolutely controlled as you can. He started doing this thing with me during the self-portrait reduction lino blocks where he'd say, okay, I'm going to want you to lay out all the prints on the floor so I can pick out the ones I like the best as my artist proofs. And I'll never forget, this was after Joe had died. And so it must have been, actually, it was this small paper self-portrait. I remember now. And I had to lay them all out. And my heart was racing because I thought, oh my God, he's going to see that, if anyone can see these tiny, tiny differences of color or application, I was like, and I was really, really scared and nervous about it. Who wants to lay their whole edition out like that?
Right.
I said, okay. So I went through this whole crisis. Okay, this is it. It's been a great run, but this is it for me, So Chuck came in and he'd say, okay, I want that one. I want that one. He would point to all these different ones. And I'd say, well, why that one? He'd say, I don't know. I just like it, and yeah. It was really stressful, but kind of exciting too at the same time.
That's funny. In my conversation with Julia DeMario, she talked about having Aldo come through and separate the piles of good, bad, and her just going into the stairwell and crying.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because I witnessed that once because I worked in Spring Street. So right down the hall was Aldo's shop. So I'd see Aldo leave because they'd walk by. He always had some famous person coming to pick him up, like Jasper Johns or something. Then I'd go in and when they were auditioning and they were all stressed out, I'd go in at the end of the day and say, hey, you want a beer or something? I remember I walked in once and Julia was almost to the point of tears and she was showing me these piles of prints and they all had tissues in between that would say too yellow or too red or something in French. Oh. And so, I said, I'm going to pull these out. So I would go in and pull the tissues out for her.
Oh
Because I mean, we'd never seen anything like this. Alto would curate the paper before he started, you know?
Oh,
Like if there was a
really?
tiny speck in the Hahnemühle, like half the Hahnemühle didn't even pass through to get printed.
Oh, I'd never thought of that. Oh, my
Yeah.
heavens.
No, absolutely. No, I know. And I'd go in there and I would just be like, whoa, I'm staying over here. Because Joe and we were a little more loosey goose and we like to have fun and stuff. We could hunker down and print too, but it was a different kind of dynamic than Aldo's sort of technique, which was very, very, very like, I don't know if tight's the right word, but
Pristine, really.
pristine. Exactly. They look like they're untouched by human hands. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It was
Which
always
is kind of
amazing.
good and bad, like,
It is. You end up being very fascinated by them. And I do have this beautiful Ed Ruscha print from that time. And I did buy some Ed Ruscha prints that Aldo did at that time with paste. And I love them. But I witnessed the agony of getting them to that state for those guys, for Julie and Bill and Kathy.
right.
I remember very clearly.
The
But
thing that, as you're talking, has popped into my brain is that, as the cataloger person in the museum collection, I would have gotten a Chuck Close, say, and it would have said the printers were you and whoever else was on the project, but
right.
it wouldn't differentiate the person who was on the plate with Chuck or Block or whatever it was versus the people who executed the edition.
Right.
So Julia was telling me that she had printed all of these Jennifer Bartlett's,
Yes.
and I had
Yes.
understood that Aldo was involved, but he was just on the plate part, not on the printing part.
It's true, and we struggled with that all the years of how to verbalize that. What happens is, to me, it was always really surprising how you could make a very clear doc sheet, and even once on this Francesco Clementi just pop up a random person. It was this letterpress print, this 3-color letterpress, like a photo magnesium thing. I would write my notes very tiny in the corner. And I went to the show at the Guggenheim of his, and there was that print. And I said, oh my God, that's one of those proofs I did. And I just looked in the corner and I could see my little notes still up there in tiny, tiny 6-point type. And they had it listed there as like a litho or something that it wasn't. So it's so interesting how documentation sheets, I don't know how that happens, but I've seen it lots of times. It's like the telephone game.
Yes.
Even when I look at prints online, I'll be like, no, that's not what that is. It's
One of the things that happens that we've talked about on other episodes is that when you receive something like Lucas in, its beautiful frame from the collector down the road, the doc sheet doesn't come with. And when you're
yes,
cataloging, you've been
yes,
trained, or I've been not paying attention to contemporary. I've been in the history part, and it's up to you to figure out what it is. So it never would
yes,
have occurred to me to call you and say, hey, Ruth, how did you
right.
make this thing?
Yeah, it is kind of interesting that a documentation sheet doesn't always just tag along with every print, and it really should. Yeah. So the other thing about having, let's say if Aldo made the plates and then Bill and Julia or Kathy printed the edition, it is true that on the doc sheet, at least at Pace, we never differentiated about that. And, I went through a whole thing with how to credit interns. And I know Joe's style when I worked with him is it doesn't hurt to be generous. You want to be generous, spread the wealth, So I knew from those early days of mine where I got zero credit for these giant, giant projects. The biggest one being this project called Soft and Fluffy Gears by Alan Shields. That was 12 prints that ended up going out to Tandem and being printed and put together out there. But I made every single one of those paper elements for that. And it was something like 10 weeks of paper making for me. It seemed weird to say, okay, the primary printers are doing this, and then somebody comes in and they help like tear down paper or something. So I started saying, okay, if you're really critical to the project, like the project can't function without you, you're going to be the primary people that are listed. If you assisted in some way, then I would say, I think sometimes I was saying interns if they were really interns. And sometimes I'd say with assistance by, meaning, they're not one of the primary people. So that's kind of how I do it now.
I think
Because
that makes sense. And one could argue that in the museum situation, in any case, that it's so rare that one is able to include any of that information on a wall label.
Yes,
The
yes,
publisher doesn't even get listed most of the time. And the
yes,
rule at the Baltimore Museum was that unless it was a actually print focused show,
yes.
none of that stuff, because it was too much for the consumer to take in. But
Right,
credit should be given where credit is due in the cataloging.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
it is perplexing because I remember Chuck had a big show at MoMA, and it was in the 90s, I think late 90s. And we were all excited about going because there were a lot of prints in there. And he had wanted to credit all the printers on the labels, and MoMA kept coming back and taking our names off. And honestly, I can't remember if we made it in or not, but we were just so excited to
I
to be.
know. Well, you probably didn't, honestly, knowing
Yeah,
MoMA.
that's always, yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, it's weird. I don't know. It's not quite right. But you know what the good
no.
news is about Platemark is that you guys are all going to be rock stars.
Yay.
And
Love
then
it.
everyone's
Love
going to say,
it.
"Oh my god, we have to credit Ruth, Bill, Kathy, and Julia."
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Kathy's my
Oh,
next mark. I'm going to have to talk to her too.
oh, good. Oh, good. She'll be very fun and informative.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Bill was telling us some of his favorite projects, most challenging disaster
Oh,
projects. Got any of those?
oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, I was thinking I'd start with some of the funniest Prince stories.
Of
One of them
course.
is Jim Dine. Okay, so Jim Dine, I started working with him in 1991. He came into Spring Street Workshop to work with Joe, and that was sort of that was a big intent of Dick Solomon's, was to set up Aldo with a spot in New York and lure Jim in. So then Jim came in. I don't really remember, or I don't how it transpired that he'd come to Spring Street, but he was going to come and work with Joe and us. And we were really nervous. Jim's a very intimidating guy, and we didn't know him at all. And he would race into the shop and he'd carve some blocks with really quickly, and he'd say, "Okay, this blue, this red, this green. I'll be back tomorrow to see him." And we'd be panic stricken and just printing as fast as we could. And we did 3 months of printing with him the entire summer. And I don't think we spoke, 10 sentences to him altogether. We just got the work done, and then we put all the proofs up. And I want to say it was about 7 or 8 or 9, big sized editions too. And he came in and he said, "I want to take you all to dinner." And so he took us out to dinner and he said, "This has been one of the great print experiences of my life. You guys are great." And we were just so thrilled because we passed the test, but we worked really, really hard to get there. Later on, working with Jim, and this was up at 18th Street when the studio moved up there, he came in and we were doing these giant oversized hearts, and they were all hand printed. So I've done a lot of editions with Jim where the blocks are too big to print on a press, including in Walla Walla, and my shoulder gets sore just thinking about it. So it's like hand rubbing these things that are giant acreage and lots of colors. So we were printing these huge prints, and Jim said, "I think I want to stamp it with my foot on this print. It's a 40 by 60. It's this giant heart in these pink colors, right?" And I said, "Oh, okay. Well, we can lay him out on the floor." Yasu had just started working, and he was working on this giant print of Chuck's of a baby. So I said, "Yasu, you got to help me on this." I'd run over and grab him for these crazy projects. And, coming from the ukiyo-e style. So I said, "Okay, I've got this palette." I had a piece of foam core or something, or plexi or something. And I rolled out this really sloppy ink on it. And then I had a roller. And then I was crawling around on the floor on top of the prints holding this thing. And Jim was hopping around on one foot, and he put his foot down on it. And then he'd jump over it and stamp the print on the ground like that. And I said, "Yasu, you got to move the prints." And Yasu has the funniest look on his face, like, "I never saw this in ukiyo-e printing before." I was so nervous because I was crawling around on the prints, and I was like, had to shove the ink thing under his foot while he's hopping around. That was a really good one. And we also did a project back in the late 80s or early 90s with an artist named Michael Young. He worked with all these sort of rubbing things and abstraction. He had done some prints where we silk screened sand into these forms. He came in and he said, "I want to do the sand again, but we're going to do it on a bigger scale." So he had these, I don't know, it was probably, maybe they were 22 by 30 or maybe even 30 by 40. We printed these giant fields of, that really stinky glue, like silk screen glue. I forget what it's called, but And then we had these bins, these trays of all this different sand that he collected from all over the world. And so we would screen this big flat of glue, and then he would pull it through the sand to create like waves in the sand. They're quite beautiful.
Hmm.
And it just stunk. This glue stunk, and we had sand everywhere. It was getting in the presses, and it was just
Oh,
a disaster. But we called it Toxic Beach, and we loved, we're like, it's like being in Jersey. And then another really funny experience I had was I traveled with Jane Hammond down to this place called the Atlantic Center in New Smyrna Beach. And we ended up doing these prints together, but we decided to work off site at this art center that was a 15-minute drive away. So we get up early and go over there every day and work on these monoprints. The whole print shop was set up for kids. So the tables were slightly over like knee high. So we're just like, it was just the funniest thing to be like hunched over like the giants for 2 weeks working on these prints.
nice.
I've done those a few times with different artists because you really have to improvise and think on your feet. And I know a lot of people say that about printmaking. I really agree that it's really problem solving. It's a lot of problem solving and just trying to have some fun while you do it. The most stressful day of printing, actually, I think it was more than one day, was out in Jim Dine's studio in Walla Walla. And Julia was there for this. He worked a lot with the Walla Walla Foundry, and they had these CNC cutters. So he wanted to do a giant print because almost everything we do out there is 40 by 60 inches. He wanted to do a giant print of a poem because he's also a poet. And so he had all this type, he painted out all these letters, and he had these alphabets made out of cut wood, but they were just made out of this really crappy, like typical wood you'd go to the lumber yard and get. Nothing hard, nothing stable. So these letters were really spindly. They're about 2 inches high, maybe, and the stems of them are half an inch wide, and they're spindly with serifs. So it's all the letters of the alphabet, right? So he cut it out. He cut this poem out of like a 40 by 60 piece of wood. So we would set it up to print it, and we'd put the whole plank of wood down, and then we put all the letters in there and ink it up. And then we had to lift the outside. If you can imagine, you lift the outside, and hundreds of little spindly wood pieces are standing in the press like this. And then I have to put a platen on it, like a piece of thin formica and a blanket, and run it through the press. And I mean, it was just so nerve-wracking because you could hear crunch as some of the letters are kind of falling over. It was the pits. I got to tell you, it was so stressful. You just didn't know what was going to happen. Printing freestanding objects that are higher than really that press, when you get up to a certain height, it has to actually hit the object before the roller goes up to that height, So I don't think we had roller bearers, so we would just, it was so stressful. We made it through it, but it was a day I never want to have to repeat.
But Jim loves accident.
Yes, he loves accidents, but that would have been the kind of accident that where you'd hear crunching sounds in the press, and there's nothing worse than that. I mean, the press is going to win over the wood type in that case, but still,
Right.
Yeah, let's see. Oh, some favorite projects of Jim's I jotted down because I have done so many editions with Jim. He did a print called The Felt Skull, and he had been in the paper mill. And I know from being in paper mills so much and working in paper mills, artists really love the felts. Like we call it a blanket in etching or relief printing, but we call it a felt in paper making. And they get these ghosts of all the other projects that are on them. And so Jim had seen these really nice paper making felts that were Joe's, these beautiful orange ones. And he said, I want to do an edition on those. I can't remember when this was, but it was early on, and we couldn't say no. But then I was like, oh no, he's going to use all our nice paper making felts up, and now we won't have any left. And I remember I started to hide all the felts because we're not going to have any felts up. But it's actually a very beautiful print. It's a woodcut of a skull on these sort of raggedy, rusty orange felts, and those are fantastic. And of course, the ones from the early year, 1991, Love and Grief is a really nice one. He had made these with these butcher blocks. Can't remember if it was Aldo or Joe had gotten them down on the Bowery, these thick pieces, like real butcher block tabletops that weighed a ton that Jim carved on. And those were real favorites. And this print called the Orange Birthday Robe we did in 2010, and that was out in Walla Walla as well. And Jim had this painting there, and he said, I think I want to make a print of this. It ended up being 34 colors in 10 print runs. And he said, okay, let's get going on this. He always liked to have me figure it out. And he said, Ruthie, how long will it take you to figure this thing out? Can we get going
no wonder
like
you
tomorrow?
like timers.
I was like, okay. So because that summer it was Bill Lagatudo, it was me, it was Julia, it was Nina, Jim's granddaughter. And, time's a ticking when you've got 30 days. So I think I had a day and a half to, figure out the colors for this very, very complicated print. And I remember going, oh God, I hope this works. I hope this works, but because you don't have, it's normally a project like that, you could spend weeks sitting there figuring that out, And another really kind of funny one and a print that I like is this one called Bleeding Boy. It's 40 by 70 inches. And that was done actually at Pace Paper. So when I was running the paper mill out there, Jim was working, he had just sold his building maybe, and he was without a studio. So he wanted to work in this little space in the back where we dried the paper. So we gave him this little teeny room, and he worked out there for, I want to say 3 weeks or something, or a month or something on some projects. So when he was there, he carved this wood block, and he said, well, I want it to be similar. And it was like that one that you were talking about earlier, the Lebanese crow, where what we did is we slobbed solvent onto the paper, and then you ink the block up. And I'll never forget this. Julia happened to be in town, and I said, you got to come and help do these prints because we need an extra set of hands, because we had to rub mineral spirits onto the paper, and then we had to take it outside and let it air dry outside for about 4 minutes, and then run it inside and print it to get the bleeding just right.
What?
So we'd lay it down, and then it would ooze just right, like just the way Jim liked it. And it was really cold out too. I remember it was like 40 degrees. So we'd run the prints outside one at a time, run them back in, hand print them. And it was just so interesting to have Jim figure out those kind of processes, where you do stuff like that.
Wait a minute. Let's hold on. Ho.
What?
I've been describing the frickin' Raven on Lebanese border wrong for 15 years. Okay, so it's hand printed, not a press, not a hydraulic, to get the
that
splooge.
One would have been printed on an etching press. The Lebanese one, but that kind of fuzzy background.
Yeah,
we would make this by either putting solvent on the paper on the block, and I
always assumed it was on the block. I would never have thought on the paper. So this is why I'm fascinated.
I can't remember with Lebanese if we did it. We probably did it on the block. I'm thinking. I think we did it on the block. I think actually now I think it's kind of coming back that Jim dumped solvent on himself while we were doing those. I'm kind of remembering that because he gets very hands-on. And but for a fact, I know that Bleeding Boy, we had to very carefully moisten the paper with mineral spirits, air dry it outside in the cold, and then rush it in and print it.
Oh my God.
Yeah. No, Jim is incredible because he's so hands-on with the processes, the grinding and all that stuff.
Right.
And of course, you've probably heard about the chainsaws.
Yes.
Right? And I mean, at one point I remember at Spring Street, Dick came upstairs and there was just wood all over because Jim had his own key to get in. He was the only artist that could come and go as he wanted. So he could just come in and grind away on the blocks whenever. So one day it was really, really messy, and Dick came up and he said, this has got to stop. Jim's got to be cleaner when he works. He's making a big mess, whatever. So he made us put up this shower curtain in the middle of the room, and it was like a tiny room with like the shower curtains around this plastic. So and Jim would cut the wood on a pallet. We had this giant sort of, it looked like a painter's palette almost, but more sturdy. So we put his big wood blocks on there, and then we put him inside this shower curtain contraption. And he came in the next time. I said, well, I guess now you're supposed to cut your blocks inside here, And so he went in and did it. I'll never forget it. I hear this crashing around in there. He rips open the thing. He's like, that's it. Take these down. I'm not working. So that lasted one day, but
Oh my God.
oh no, Jim is a master with the power tools. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. In those days, there were machine shops, there were places to get your chainsaw sharpened. So I'll never forget Julie and I had our summer dresses on, and we had to walk the chainsaws down to somewhere in Soho to get them sharpened. And all these construction guys were like, whoa, like women with chainsaws. That was the funniest thing ever.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I mean, I've been lucky because I've worked on so many great projects. I've worked with 80 different artists and writers too. I work with poets. Jim crosses over, but the poets are sort of a genre into themselves.
Right.
And paper makers too. So,
Mhm.
I don't know. It's like I have so many favorite projects. I have favorite projects by each artist,
Oh, okay.
so
Oh gosh. All right, you need to write a book.
yeah. And I did want to mention a really challenging project, and that was Robert Ryman. I would say that's like a highlight project of my printing career, was working with him. He was a super nice man. The way we came about the technique, which was relief printing from all these different materials, took quite a long time, as I remember, and Bill would remember too. I want to say it took like 8 months or so of him coming in weekly and doing tests. It was amazing to watch him work and think about things. And he didn't really verbalize specific things. He would say, like, well, I kind of like this, and let's try something more in this direction. He gave you a lot of latitude for working, but also you're kind of trying to figure out how he's thinking. And it was very, very cryptic to me for a long time to figure out how to proceed, because he didn't give you actual direction of do this, do that. And it kind of reminded me, I was lucky to get to work with John Chamberlain, the sculptor, at his studio down in Florida. And he was the same way. He would say, just do
Oh
your
boy.
thing, and I'll respond once you've done something. It's fun. But the Ryman projects I always really liked. And they were printed on metal,
Oh,
and
right, right.
they
Yeah,
got nailed directly to the wall. So
right.
he did a lot of handwork on them after they were done, drawing a signature, and not a lot, but he would stay sometimes after work and we would talk, and he would tell me stories about, when he first moved to New York.
Yeah, right. So tell us about Line Press and what you're up to now. How long have you
Line
had Line
press?
Press? Yeah.
That was sort of my stepping out of the 9 to 5. This was supposed to be my segue into focusing on getting back to the artist books again. Because all the years I worked at Pace, I had my own studio and I would chug away on things. I did a lot of contract printing, job printing, letterpress, all kinds of stuff. I'm doing a whole bunch of artist books right now. I just got back from signing some haiku prints with a poet named Reginald Dwayne Batts just yesterday, actually. He's a poet and a lawyer, and he advocates for prison reform, and he's building libraries and putting them in prisons. We're working on a big artist book, and it's all made with handmade paper that I've been making, that is made from sweatpants and t-shirts and socks and things that are worn by inmates that he's either working with to help get out or knows in some capacity. So it's really crazy because I've been making this paper out of sweatpants, and it looks exactly and feels exactly like sweatpants. So this
Oh,
whole
wow.
book will be the story of his experiences in prison. And I think it's going to be really powerful because I've been stockpiling paper made with orange t-shirts, which you think of, sweatpants, weird socks, and just, I have about 3 different colors of stuff.
Oh,
So
cool.
that's a big project I'm doing now. And I'm actually making this crazy book of Jim Dine's right now, 2 books with Jim. One is a more straightforward poetry with images with 27 lithos and 3 long poems. Those are all plates that were made for this giant triptych that's now up at Christia Roberts called Astonishing Health and Sunshine.
Oh, yeah.
It's a giant project. It started with him making litho plates of botanical drawings, and they're about 6 by 9 inches. They're small. So he drew a ton of those. And I think we ended up having 64 plates like that. And they'd always wanted to put color on them. So then they have either one or most of them have 2 spit by plates that Julia made. And then they also had a dry point too that went on that. And that was always intended to be this artist book. And as we were working on it, and I was working on this very, very long poem with them, it became evident at a certain point that turning this into an artist book was going to consume, 5 years for all of us or something. So then Jim sort of went a different route, and he took all the images and worked with Steidl, who's this bookmaker in Germany, and made a commercial, when I say commercial, offset printed book of it. That's really beautiful. And then we went ahead and made this giant print, but because this had been going on for 2.5 years, it's been going on since 2019. When we came back and we finished that, and I was looking around and I said, wow, we have over 400 proofs left. 400 proofs left from this one project.
Oh my God.
And they're beautiful. They're these beautiful, beautiful botanicals. So I said to Jim, how about you let me go back and do the original Electrolyte in Blue, which is the name of the poem. Just let me do this. Just give me carte blanche, because we'd had a number of very focused sessions to try to make this book, so we already had it pretty far along, like in our minds and layouts and everything. And he said, okay. And I said, great, I'm going to just do the typography, and you're just going to get them, and they're all going to be different. So it's a small edition of 6. So I've been setting type, printing over these beautiful spit bite litho combos. And when I say I have 6, I have to print 6 perfectly, set the type, print 6 perfectly. And there's only been 2 typos in a very, very long poem. So I feel pretty good about that. And so I literally just printed the last page a couple of days ago, and it's the book itself, when bound up, is going to be 1.5 inches thick.
Right.
And Jim kind of threw it out one time. He said, well, it's kind of like my magnum opus. And so, I said that I call it the real opus. This is the real opus. And it's really spectacular. And it's been super fun to just pull it out, work on it here and there. It's a little bit of a back burner project, but that's something I've been working on and just really loving that to death too.
Wow. My curator brain's thinking, I wonder how much that's going to cost a museum.
Well, it actually won't be for sale. And you know why? Because what happened, there was all of us collaborators on this thing, the printers, because we did these tiny plates, 6 by 9 inches, there were 60 of them put together into this huge triptych. So there was only 15 of those. So of course we wanted single prints, but Jim, said that's not the way these should be presented. So I said, if I do this project, can it be for those of us that worked on the project? And of course, we'll have 2 copies, and then the rest of us will have a copy.
Oh, that's great.
So so that's what's going to happen to them. But, hopefully they'll get seen in some capacity somehow.
Oh, that's nice.
So,
well, maybe some curator listening will say, Ruth, may I borrow your book for a show?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, that's great. So your assistant printer person in your shop at Line Press is none other than Jim's granddaughter, Nina.
It sure is.
Yeah.
It sure is. And Nina came on as first our sort of intern in Walla Walla years ago. She would come when I worked at Paste Paper, and that was 8 years I was there. She would come and help me here or there on projects. She's a Tamron Master printer, litho. And so I thought it'd be really fun to have her here working with me. And, Jim does stop in here when he comes through Paris and does, works on his prints and stuff. Yeah. And I do contract printing for a lot of different people. I'm also finishing a giant artist book project with Michael Stipe, the singer from REM. And he and I have worked on 3 or 4 big projects over the last 10 years. And he always calls himself a frustrated graphic designer. He studied art as well, of course, and started out in visual art, I believe. And so we've worked on a couple of book projects together. And this is this giant, giant project that we've just finished that's been going on a couple of years too. 34 different editions of these book objects that are all hand printed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I wonder if those kinds of people who have made it in another manner as a singer or whatever, actor, do people feel like they're less legitimate somehow as artists making that transition?
Well, yeah, I mean,
which is unfair, of course.
Yeah, it is unfair. I mean, he's very, very, very intelligent and very thoughtful. I think he's a very good artist. What he's done with the printed things that we've done is he's incorporated sometimes some of them into sculptural works, or there'll be an element of sculptural work. But yeah, I think sometimes people, yeah, I would say probably there's a little bit of that sort of, I don't want to say dismissive. That's not the right word, because that's not what it is. But a lot of people are also in awe too, like, wow, that's amazing. Because I think creative types, a lot of creative people just swing around music and art. I feel like I don't know a single artist or printmaker that isn't kind of heavily into music.
Oh, interesting.
And so it just seems like the creative fields cross over so much.
Yeah, of course. It's a special kind of brain in person, right?
Yeah,
Here we
exactly.
all are. It's a happy
He's
club.
very intimidating too, I'll tell you that. He really is.
Yeah, no, sure. People tell me I'm intimidating. I'm like, I'm so sorry. What? Just a
Yeah,
kid with
no,
a
you
cool
can't
job.
hold the candle to Michael, sorry.
Yeah, right, exactly.
But,
all right, Ruth, I think I've
yeah.
held you long enough on a Friday evening, so we should.
Okay, well, I hope I feel like I got all off track about everything, but,
You did not. It was great.
you'll fix
Thank
that
you.
up, I'm sure, right?
I love to let the conversation go where it goes, because it's a conversation, not me going, we must answer these 10 questions. It's
Yes.
silly.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. No, I guess, and yeah, thinking about specific, I know people do ask me that, what's your favorite thing? And I always, I struggle with that because the list is really long. I'm trying to cull out from my collection right now the things I really want to have forever. And it's really hard. I have it narrowed down to about 50 prints, which
oh, wow.
some people might think is a lot, but I'm like, no, it's not, because I hate getting rid of, my prints actually.
Right. My cat is coming in the room. He's like, it's dinner time.
Okay.
Mom.
Thank you, Ann.
Ruth, thank you so much for coming on Platemark. It was great talking to you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Platemark with Ruth Lingen, a fabulous guest, as they all have been. Thank you for joining me here, and a special thank you going out to her for being such a wonderful interviewee. And as always, a thank you to Michael Diamond for the use of his original music. Head on over to platemarkpodcast.com. You'll find all of the images we talk about over there in the show notes, and you can click the support and donate button and help me keep the lights on. I'd really appreciate it. It's just me doing this. All right, we will see you next time.